So now let's turn over to Mark, to the left, Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10. Now here in Mark chapter 10, the Pharisees asked Jesus about divorce. And we're not going to talk about divorce. We're just going to look at Jesus' answer to their question. That's what we're interested in. Verse 2, Mark chapter 10, verse 2, the Pharisees came and they asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" And they were testing Jesus. They were trying to trap him in his words. And he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" Now, stop right there. Jesus believed there was a real person named Moses who penned the law of God, including the book of Genesis. Now, I point that out because you may not know this. There are many theologians, professors in seminaries, and even pastors in pulpits today who do not believe Moses ever existed. That there was never a guy named Moses. Jesus believed there was a Moses. Jesus believed there was a Moses, that he was a real person. Well, they said Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her, and Jesus answered and said to them, "Because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept." Now watch what he says in verse 6. "But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate." Jesus here in his answer, he referenced the opening chapters of Genesis, and he's talking here about Adam and Eve. In verse 7, he quotes from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, when he says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife." That's in Genesis 2. That's talking about Adam and Eve. Notice what he says in verse 6. This is really important, verse 6. He says, "But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female." Jesus believed in creation, just as it's recorded in Genesis chapter 1. He took Genesis chapter 1 to be a straightforward history of creation, not allegorical. He took it literally. He believed that God created the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. God made them male and female. He's quoting right out of the Genesis account. Jesus believed that Adam and Eve were real people, that God created the first two humans, that they really existed, just as Genesis says. And notice also his wording here. Jesus said he made them male and female at the beginning of the creation. Again, this shows us that Jesus took Genesis chapter 1 literally. Genesis 1 says that man was created on the sixth day of creation. This also shows that Jesus took a day to be a day, a literal 24-hour day. Adam and Eve were created, he says, at the beginning of creation. They've existed from the beginning. Now, evolutionary theory says that God did not create the heavens and the earth. That the earth came into existence 5 billion years ago, and about 66 million years ago, man evolved and came into existence on the earth. 4 billion years after the earth came into existence. That's not what Genesis and Jesus say. Genesis and Jesus both say that Adam and Eve were created by God essentially at the same time that God created everything else, that they were at the beginning of creation. Now, this also refutes what's called the day-age theory that some Christians believe in. There is a theory that in the Genesis account, the days of creation don't mean literal 24-hour days, that those days represent millions or even billions of years. They represent ages, and we'll talk more about that in future weeks. But Jesus says here that Adam and Eve were at the beginning of creation. So he believed the creation account in Genesis 1. He interpreted it literally. He took the plain meaning of Genesis chapter 1. He didn't read anything into it. He didn't try to stretch it into anything else. He just believed what it said. And he believed the first two human beings were Adam and Eve, and that they were created on the sixth day, just as it says in Genesis. This is what Jesus believed. Let's look at another example. Turn with me over to Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17. Now here in Luke chapter 17, Jesus speaks about his second coming and his judgment of the earth. Now the Bible teaches that Jesus will one day return to the earth, literally, physically. It's described for us in several passages. Most vividly, it's described for us in Revelation, where he comes riding out of heaven on a white horse, robe dipped in blood. The armies of heaven are with him, and he comes back to the earth. He's going to stand on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. The mountain's going to split in half. He's going to establish his kingdom on the earth, and then he's going to judge the nations of the earth. In fact, the Bible has more to say about his second coming than his first coming. Well, here in Luke chapter 17, I want you to see what he does here. Jesus compares the time of his second coming to the time of Noah and the flood, which is described in Genesis chapters 6, 7, and 8. And then he compares his second coming and his judgment of the earth to the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, described in Genesis 19. Again, there are many who would say Noah never existed. There was no global flood. There's no evidence of a global flood. I mean, it's crazy to think a guy built an ark and saved his family and the animals. That's just fairy tale. I mean, that's great for the Sunday school classes, but that's not reality. That's not real history. And there are some that say Sodom and Gomorrah never existed. It's just folklore. Well, look at verse 26. Jesus says, "And as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man," or when the Son of Man comes, again is the idea. Now he describes the days of Noah. And where does he get his idea of what the days of Noah were like? Genesis chapter 7. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, it will also, as if it was also in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Now, clearly, this passage shows that Jesus believed that there was a Noah and that there was a global flood, that God judged the earth with a flood, that it was a historical event, a real event, and that Noah and his family survived by an ark. I mean, he mentions Noah by name, he mentions the flood, he mentions the ark, and what he says here. He took it as straightforward history, just as it's written. He takes it as straightforward, accurate, historical record. Jesus also believed that God judged the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by raining down fire and brimstone from heaven and destroying them, just as it says in Genesis 19. And the audience that he said this to also believed those stories as true and real historical events. More importantly, don't miss this, more importantly, Jesus tied, and I want you to get this, Jesus tied his second coming to the account of Noah and the flood and to Sodom and Gomorrah. So if the accounts in Genesis are mythology and poetic and not to be taken literally, well then the second coming of Jesus Christ and his judgment of the earth is mythology. It's not to be taken literally. It's just poetic. In other words, our eschatology, what we believe about the return of Christ, it falls apart if Genesis is not historical. Because Jesus linked them. He tied them together. We can't say, well, I believe that Jesus is coming back, and he's going to come back in power and great glory, riding on a horse out of heaven, robe dipped in blood. He's going to stand on the Mount of Olives. He's going to establish his kingdom on the earth. He's going to be King of kings and Lord of lords, and he's going to judge the earth. But I don't really believe the story of Noah. I mean, an ark, a flood, that's just too much. There's no way that's true. Jesus tied them together. They stand or fall together.